Mashburn, and I'm going to give you your first lab video. I'm going to do this with a PowerPoint, and I'm going to try to also do an actual video where I stand over the camera and kind of do it in 3D. But between the two videos, you should get a really good idea of what you're expected to know as far as lab goes. And this is kind of the anatomy part of the course. This is where you figure out where it is. When I lecture to you, most of the time that's the physiology, how it works, but we're going to today is just where it is. You know, how do you find it? Let me get my pen started. Hang on. Now, in your Blackboard shell, I have listed all the structures that you're responsible for knowing and being able to locate. All the structures you should be able to locate. When you're tested on this, you're basically going to see pictures. You're going to take your exam, and pictures are going to come up on the screen, and you'll have to tell me what those are. It's not multiple choice. There's no word bank. You just have to remember what the picture is and type in the organ. And the question will ask you, name this organ, name this cavity, name this plane, name this structure, and you'll just type in your answer. This page here is basically a list of everything you're expected to be able to recognize. So I'm going to try to go down this list as I go through my pictures and basically identify everything in the body using the models that we have here at Calhoun in our lab. So if you have questions or you're not sure about a picture, let me know, and I can re-upload a picture, make it bigger. You guys let me know what you need, and I will try to accommodate you as best I can. All right, so the first thing we have to do is hopefully you have watched some of the videos and you know about cavities. So this is a picture of our models that we have in the lab. They look just like this. And just as a review, hopefully for you, we have two main cavities. When you look at the body, you have a ventral cavity, which is the front side. So you have the ventral, all the stuff on the front. You have the dorsal, which is on the back. So here's your ventral side. Remember, you breathe in your ventral side. Like use a ventilator. So your front side is your ventral side. Your back side is your dorsal side, like the dorsal fin on a dolphin. Alright, so what we're going to do now is we're going to talk about which organs you find inside each one of these cavities. So let's start with the dorsal side. On the dorsal side, this includes the cranial cavity and the spinal cavity. Okay, you have your cranial cavity, which is inside your head. Your whole head is called cephalic. So your face and where your brain is basically the cephalic region. The cranial cavity is where your brain is. That's the cranial cavity. The spinal cavity is where your backbone is. It's actually the cavity inside the vertebra that houses your spinal cord. So looking down into the cranial cavity, you can see there's a hole here, and your brain is inside that cavity. So here's a picture of the brain. This is looking at the brain. This is basically the cerebrum, the cerebellum. You have your brain stem, and your spinal cord is coming off down toward the inferior side. And I'm going to try to start using some of that terminology that you've needed to become familiar with, like superior, inferior, medial, lateral. If you haven't looked at that, go back and watch that video and make sure you understand some of that terminology. Now this is looking at a sagittal cut, which means dividing someone left and right of the brain, looking on the inside. And some of the structures that you should be able to recognize at this point, again, here's your cerebrum, here's your cerebellum, your brain stem, and here's the pituitary. It's one of those endocrine organs we talked about earlier in the semester. So here's one of the endocrine organs that you can recognize. In the spinal cavity, here's your spinal cord. Runs all the way up and down the back inside the vertebra. And then you have spinal nerves that come off of the spinal cord. This is a cross section of the spinal cord, and this is the spinal cord. You can see this inside of a vertebra. This is a vertebra that you'll learn about in when we talk about bones in unit 3, in the bone section. And this is your actual spinal cord. And here's a spinal nerve coming off to either side. Not a whole lot to learn about the dorsal cavity. It's pretty easy. The ventral cavity is a little more complex. So the ventral cavity is all the stuff on the front. When we talk about the ventral cavity, we divide it into even smaller sections. One of the things you need to be able to think about as you go through this is these organs. You need to think about the smallest organ that you can find, smallest cavity that you can find an organ in. So let me give you an example real quick. This is a lung, okay? It's in the ventral cavity, it's in the front. It's also in the thoracic cavity. And your thoracic cavity is anything above the diaphragm, basically your heart, lungs, your chest, inside the rib cage. Okay? Each lung is also in its own pleural cavity. So on a test, I said the lung, mark all but apply. I said the lung is in which cavity, and I had a whole list of cavities. You would say it's in the ventral cavity, it's in the thoracic cavity, and then it's in the pleural cavity. So you want to think about these organs and think about all the cavities that they're in, and not just in one. They're usually in several smaller and smaller cavities. Alright, so let's start with this is the thoracic cavity, again, your lungs and heart, anything above the diaphragm, which is your breathing muscle. This is your abdominopelvic cavity. Your abdominopelvic cavity can be divided into your abdominal cavity and your pelvic cavity. So using this picture, I've removed all the organs on this one. This is your abdominal cavity, and you can actually see there's a smaller cavity inside that called the pelvic cavity. So together it's abdominopelvic, separated it's abdominal, pelvic, and then this is the thoracic cavity here. So we're going to talk about the organs that you would find in each one of these cavities. So here's the thoracic cavity. You have a lung, two lungs actually, and this is a good time for me to talk about anatomical position and anatomical left and right. Remember when you're looking at someone, it's going to appear backwards to you. This is actually the left side over here, and this is the right side. So this is anatomical left, and this is anatomical right. So on a test, I may say, name this organ and tell me if it's left or right. Well, this will be the left lung, and this will be the right lung. You can always tell the left lung, even if they were separated by this little notch here. It's called the cardiac notch. It actually is a little space so that the heart can beat. It doesn't bump into the lung. If you know where your heart is, it's actually in the middle of your body, medial, but it's tilted just slightly to the left. So this is your left lung, and this is your right lung, and this is your heart. And remember I talked about arteries and veins back in one of the first videos you saw. This is the aorta. It's an artery taking blood away from the heart, and these are some of your veins taking blood back to the heart. You can also see right here, this is the trachea, just superior to the heart and lungs. And while I'm using those terms, how would you describe the heart to the lungs? The heart is medial, in between, it's medial to the lungs. The lungs would be lateral to the heart. So I've taken one of the lungs away. So here's your heart. I've removed the left lung. Now one thing I want to point out, if you look, this is looking inside the lung. We've talked about arteries and veins. Arteries take blood away from the heart. Veins take blood to the heart. Usually, in most of your body, the arteries are red, the veins are blue. The arteries are taking blood away, the veins are bringing blood to. So the red arteries they have oxygen, and the blue veins, they don't have oxygen, so they're blue. Basically, what oxygen does, it makes the blood turn red because it binds with what's called an iron inside the hemoglobin. And if you've ever left something made of iron outside and it oxidizes, it turns red, basically your blood oxidizes. It looks kind of rusty. That gives it its red color. So usually, red things are arteries, blue things are veins, except in the lungs, and you just have to remember that. In the lungs, you've got to go get the oxygen. So blood comes into the heart. It comes into the right side. So it's coming back from the body. You dumped off all your oxygen. You've got to go get some. So basically, this isn't actually an artery, this blue thing. It's a pulmonary artery. It's going to go out to the lungs. These are still arteries. They're going away. They're going to get the oxygen. They're going to exchange with the capillaries and inside the lungs. They're going to pick up the oxygen. And now these are veins. They're bringing blood back. And the veins are going to bring, right here there's the pulmonary vein, they're going to bring the blood back to the heart. So in the lungs, the blue things are arteries, and the red things are veins. And you just have to remember it. And it'll become easier the more you do it. So on this model, this is the aorta, taking blood out to the rest of the body. This is the vena cava, bringing all the blood back to the heart. You have a superior, which means it brings blood from the top of the body, and there's actually an inferior vena cava that brings blood from the bottom of the body. And this blue one actually is an artery because it's taking blood to the lungs to go get oxygen. Alright. So, now I've taken out both lungs, I've taken out the heart so that you can see deep inside the thoracic cavity. Got your veins and your arteries. Here's your trachea. That's bringing that air down from the mouth into the lungs. So this is the trachea. It divides into a left and right bronchus. This is your left bronchus. This is your right bronchus. Those bronchus will then divide even further into bronchioles so that you can take air all the way out to all parts of the lungs. This is where that exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide takes place. Now, if you look at a sagittal cut, a cut that divides you left and right, here's the mouth, here's the nose. So air can come in the mouth, you breathe your mouth, or through the nose. Comes in through here. This is basically called the pharynx. This whole region here is the pharynx, the back of your throat. The air will then go down the trachea. You can actually feel your trachea. It's on the front or anterior side of your body. This is the trachea. This other tube is called the esophagus. That's where the food goes. So the air comes down the trachea and then divides left and right bronchus and then into the bronchioles. There's a little flap here called the epiglottis. And it's a little flap, so when you eat food, the epiglottis will actually cover the trachea so you don't get food down your windpipe. And then this is the diaphragm. This is the big breathing muscle. And so anything above or superior to the diaphragm is thoracic cavity. Anything below is inferior. On this model, this is the esophagus. You can actually see the esophagus. It's behind or posterior to the trachea, and so the food would travel behind the lungs and go down into the stomach. Okay, so now we're going to be in the abdominal pelvic cavity. So all this, here's the diaphragm. So all this stuff below the diaphragm is abdominal pelvic cavity. And we're going to look at each one of these organs and we'll pull them out and show you what's behind them. This big organ here, this is the liver. This is the gallbladder. And we'll talk about function as we go along. But basically the liver and gallbladder produce enzymes that help you break down food. This is the stomach, so food comes down the esophagus and is stored in the stomach. This is where some of that digestion takes place. You start to churn up the food and break it down. Food leaves the stomach and goes into the small intestine. This is this yellow stuff. After the food's been processed and you've absorbed all you really want from out of the small intestine, the rest of it goes into the large intestine. And that's this gray thing. And we're going to give each part of this intestine a specific name, but hang on just a minute. So liver, gallbladder, stomach, small intestine, large intestine. So I pulled out the liver. You need to recognize these organs when they're not inside the body. You need to recognize them when they're just all by themselves. So this is the front side of the liver. Turn it around, looking at the posterior side. This is the back of the liver. This is the gallbladder. So you can see the gallbladder is posterior, on the posterior side of the liver. And then this is the stomach. All I need to say about that. Okay, here's the small intestine. And this is the small intestine, and this is the large intestine. Now there's three parts to the small intestine. There is the duodenum or duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. I missed that. Ileum, yeah. Alright. This is the first section, the second section, and the third section. And the way these models are made, you really can't see the different sections. So usually what I will tell my students is, if I ask you on a test, I'll say, the food enters this first section of the small intestine. What do you call that? So this first section is the duodenum or duodenum. The second section is the jejunum, and then the third section is the ileum. Now make sure ileum you spell with an E. In the hip, there's a bone called the ilium, also pronounced ilium, but that's a bone. So if you write ilium and spell it this way, I'm going to think you mean a bone. So make sure you watch your spelling. Now this is the large intestine. I basically removed the small intestine, and you can see the large intestine. Some of the parts, this is the appendix, a little appendage that sticks off. And this is your landmark. This is the food enters from the small intestine right here. So find your appendix, and that's the beginning of the large intestine. The food then travels up. So this is the ascending colon. It's going up. And then the food goes across. This is the transverse colon. And then this is the descending colon. So the food, the direction of travel of the food is this direction. So up the ascending colon, across the transverse colon, down the descending colon, and into the rectum. The last part of the large intestine is called the anus. That's where the feces exits the body. So this part's the rectum, and then the actual hole where the feces exits is the actual anus. Alright, let's see. Okay, so I've removed the liver was here, the stomach was here, the small and large intestines, they were all down in here. I've removed all that. I'm going to look behind there and find what's back there. We have a liver. I do this in lab too, guys. You get to talking and sometimes you forget what you're going to say. You have a kidney. This is a kidney, and here's one here that's kind of hidden. Looking at this is the left kidney, this is the right kidney. Okay, this is part of the small intestine. This is the pancreas. These are your adrenal glands, your left and right adrenal glands. And this is your spleen. So you have your kidneys here and here, the pancreas, this is small intestine, adrenal glands, and spleen. Those are all what you can see in this part of the body. You also have these two tubes, and each one of these tubes is coming from a kidney, and these are your ureters. These are the tubes that will carry the urine that your kidneys make and take them down to the bladder so that you can store it until you're ready to go to the bathroom. These red things, these are arteries. These blue things are veins. And all this red stuff here, these are muscles. These are ribs, in case you're wondering. We're seeing cross sections of the ribs. And then that is some skin. Alright, so just kind of blew it up a little bit more. Took the cover off the kidney so you could see inside. This is inside the kidney. You'll learn that anatomy later on, but that's what it looks like inside. This is, again, the adrenal gland. This is a part of the inferior vena cava. This is that big vein that's taking blood back to the heart. Again, here's your pancreas. Here's your pancreas again. Another adrenal gland, part of the kidney, here and here. It's behind or posterior to the pancreas, and here is the spleen. Alright, so there's looking into the pelvic cavity. Okay, so we've taken out all the organs and we're looking deep into the pelvic cavity. Here are those ureters, and they're going to take the urine to the bladder. And that's actually the bladder where you would store the urine. If you remove the bladder, you can actually see the anus, and so the large intestine, the rectum would come down to the anus, and that's how the feces would exit the body. That's all on that page. Okay, so once we get to this part of the body, things start to change a little bit. There's some differences between boys and girls. So we've got to talk about the female and the male. So this is the female, and this is a front view, looking at the front of the female. We have a transverse cut. We basically cut this model from superior to inferior, dividing top and bottom. And you have a sagittal cut, where you divided the person or the model from left to right. And what you're seeing here, this is the bladder, and this is a fallopian tube or uterine tube, and this is an ovary, the left one. This is the fallopian tube, and this is an ovary. This is the right one, and you're seeing part of the large intestine back there. So now we're going to look at a side view. Looking at that sagittal cut. Here's the inside of the backbone. These are vertebrae that you're seeing right here. Here's that large intestine. You see a little ovary sticking right there. this tube, this is the ureter bringing urine down from the kidney into the bladder. Now we're going to remove this section so that you can look inside. Okay, so this is the female. It's a sagittal cut, and you can see basically all the parts I want you to be able to identify. So here's your ureter again, bringing urine from the kidney to the bladder. There is the ovary and the fallopian tube or uterine tube. Here's part of the large intestine. Okay, here's the rectum. And then the female has 3 openings. So this is the anus, this is one we've already talked about, okay, where the feces exits the body. We have the vagina, which is the entryway or exitway, entryway into the vagina or the exit for the baby from the uterus. This is the uterus. And this is the bladder. So the exit to the bladder, this is the urethra. So urine is stored inside the bladder and exits the body through the urethra. So you have your bladder, your uterus, the vagina, the rectum, and the anus. You'll notice that the uterus is superior to the bladder. So that's why when you are pregnant and that baby is growing inside here and getting bigger and bigger and bigger, it puts pressure on the bladder and makes you have to pee. So that's why, because it's on top of or superior to the uterus. Here's the male. Here's your ureter again, taking urine from the kidney to the bladder. Here's the bladder. Here's the penis, and here are the testes. Here's the side view again, large intestine, ureter. Here's your bladder. This is the prostate. You have your penis, and you have the testes inside the scrotum, which is the sac that holds the testes. Take that off and look inside. So here we go. Here's the backbone again. Here's your vertebra. Here's your ureters, large intestine. Here's your rectum. Here's your anus. Now guys don't have a uterus or a vagina, so they only got 2 openings. Here is the urethra, so this must be the bladder. So here's the bladder where the urine is stored. The urine leaves the bladder out the urethra through the penis. Here is the scrotum that holds the testes. And this is the prostate. And you'll notice in older men, when they have problems urinating because of an enlarged prostate, because that prostate is wrapped right around the urethra. So as it enlarges, it actually squeezes the urethra and makes it harder to urinate. So men who've had enlarged prostates or prostate cancer, a lot of times will have problems with voiding their bladder or emptying their bladder. Okay, so now we're kind of go back up to the head and neck. I've got a few little things to clarify on head and neck. Make sure you know that. Let me look at my list, make sure I haven't missed anything. I think I've got it all. Alright, on the head and neck, when looking at the list, the first thing we're going to talk about are the salivary glands. And that's the stuff that makes spit. Okay, the stuff inside your mouth that makes spit. And you actually have several salivary glands. These are located here. You actually have some located, down here. Lost my pen again. Sorry guys. Down below, they're right here. If I X wasn't there, you'd see a little, they're right here, but you can't really see them. My arrow's in the way. There's a set there, and there's a set underneath the tongue. Oh, I've got a different color pen. That's weird. Are you guys entertained? I hope you're entertained. Hang on, technical difficulties. Okay. It's just in the wrong place. Let me see if I can move that up a little bit. Now, anyway, there's a salivary gland here, and there's one right under there, and there's one right there. So those make the spit. You have the thyroid, which is located right in front of the trachea, right here, right in front of the trachea. You have your thyroid gland, and you can see it here. It's like a little butterfly-shaped gland. If you were to remove this layer, it's underneath this muscle, so it should make a little U, butterfly shape on either side of the trachea. You have your pharynx and your larynx. So your pharynx and your larynx. Your pharynx is basically that area behind your nose and mouth, so it's kind of the back of your throat. You actually have a nasopharynx and you have an oral pharynx, and so this whole thing is called the pharynx, and it's a cavity or a space, and it's how air gets from your nose and your mouth down into your trachea. It's how the food gets from your mouth down into the esophagus, and it's all connected. And the best example of that is if you've ever been somewhere and you get tickled and you're drinking a Coke and the Coke comes out your nose. That shows you that your mouth and your nose are connected through this pharynx. Now the larynx is basically what you would call your voice box. So let me go to this next slide. You can see it a little bit better. The larynx is this area here, kind of top of the trachea where your vocal cords are. That's your larynx. And then all of this area here is basically the pharynx. Don't say pharynx or larynx. It's pharynx and larynx. Just have to learn how to spell it. R-Y-N-X on both of them, pharynx and larynx. All right, two other cavities. You have your buccal cavity and your oral cavity. Your oral cavity is basically inside the teeth. So think about where your tongue is, and your tongue's inside your teeth, inside your mouth. That's your oral cavity. The buccal cavity, that's kind of cavity on the outside of the teeth. So when you blow your cheeks out, that space between your cheeks and your teeth, that's your buccal cavity. You have your otic cavity. Anytime you see the word otic, that means ear. So that's anything that stick your finger in, that's your otic cavity. And your orbital cavity. And an orbit is round, and so the only thing that's really round on your body is your eye. And so your orbital cavity is the cavity that surrounds your eye, where your eyeball is. And then last but not least, we have our lymph vessels. And you have lymph vessels all over your body. We just have a few of them that show up on the models, but you find them here, and you find them here, and just about everywhere. And these are these pink things. These are the lymph vessels, and then these little brown things, those are the lymph nodes. And we name our lymph vessels based on the region where they're located. So this would be axillary up under the arm. This is the axillary lymph vessels, the lymph nodes. Down here, this would be your inguinal lymph glands and lymph nodes. So when you identify lymph glands and lymph nodes, you just look at their region and give them a region name. The only thing I want to say is don't forget your membranes, okay? This whole time we've been talking about all these organs. You have to remember, you've got to think about the organs, where they are, and you've got to think about what's surrounding them. So go back and watch that video if you haven't seen it yet. There was one by Dr. Linsardi, and he talked about visceral and parietal membranes. So remember, the visceral membranes cover the organ, and the parietal membranes cover the cavity. So if you have a visceral pericardium, that is the membrane that's surrounding the heart, whereas the parietal pericardium is the membrane surrounding the cavity. If you have a pleural, a visceral pleural cavity membrane, that's surrounding the lung. A parietal pleura or parietal pleural membrane is surrounding the cavity. And if you see the word peritoneum, that's the abdominal cavity. So your visceral peritoneum is surrounding the organs in the abdomen, and your parietal peritoneum is surrounding the abdominal cavity. So if you haven't looked at that, go back and think about your membranes. Alright, again, I hope this was helpful to you. I'm going to try to do another video where I actually go in the lab and actually film one of the instructors doing this lab to kind of give you another way of looking at it and see us pulling out the organs and see how they fit together. If you have any questions, please call, email me to the blackboard, come by my office. Myself or the other instructors will be glad to help you. Thanks a lot, and I will see you next time.